In the fertile floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates, civilizations had been rising and falling for millennia. The Sumerians built the first cities. The Akkadians forged empires from the fragments of the Bronze Age. Yet, it was in this crucible of culture, trade, and warfare that the Assyrians would emerge not as builders of a fleeting city-state, but as architects of the first true empire of the Iron Age. To walk the streets of ancient Assur, the city that gave them their name, was to witness the quiet hum of administration, commerce, and religion intertwined. Merchants moved goods, grain, timber, metals, and textiles across routes connecting the Levant, Anatolia, and the Zagros Mountains. Priests performed rituals to maintain cosmic balance, believing that the favor of the gods underpinned every aspect of life. And kings, seated in modest palaces at first, would rise to command armies that historians still marvel at today. The story of the Assyrians is one of contrasts: cruelty and culture, innovation and tradition, ambition and vulnerability. They were feared across the Near East for the efficiency and brutality of their armies. Their warriors, armed with iron swords and spears, perfected the art of siegecraft, breaking through city walls that had never yielded before. Yet, these same people built libraries and palaces and left behind written records that captured poetry, law, astronomy, and trade. It is tempting to see the Assyrians purely through the lens of terror, for their reputation as conquerors has long overshadowed the nuances of their civilization. But to do so is to overlook their brilliance. The development of administrative systems that managed distant provinces, the organization of trade that linked disparate cultures, and the codification of laws and religion that bound their society together. From the earliest settlements in Assur to the height of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, this civilization exemplifies how order and ambition can transform a modest city-state into a dominion that stretches across continents. And yet, their story is not only about power, it is about fragility. Even the most formidable empires, built on intelligence, innovation, and fear, are vulnerable to internal dissent, economic strain, and the shifting tides of war. Understanding the Assyrians begins with understanding their world. Mesopotamia was a land of extremes. Unpredictable rivers, scorching summers, and fertile soil that invited cultivation and conflict alike. Here, city-states competed for water, trade, and land. Alliances were fragile, wars frequent, and survival required not just strength, but strategy. In this environment, the Assyrians learned to balance diplomacy with domination, commerce with conquest, and tradition with innovation. The gods, ever present in Assyrian life, were both guides and arbiters. Kings claimed divine sanction for their campaigns, believing that victory was not merely a result of human skill, but of heavenly favor. Temples dominated city skylines, and offerings to deities like Assur, the chief god, and Ishtar, the goddess of war and fertility, were central to both civic and personal life. The intertwining of religion and governance gave Assyrian rulers legitimacy, authority, and the ability to mobilize their population for both construction and warfare. Yet, beyond the streets, the temples, and the palaces, the Assyrians were keen observers of the world. They recorded celestial phenomena, mapped trade routes, and documented the achievements of other civilizations. Their scribes, using cuneiform script on clay tablets, ensured that knowledge would survive long after kings and empires faded. These records would later allow historians to reconstruct the life, ambitions, and strategies of a people whose military might was only matched by their administrative genius. Even the landscape bore witness to their rise. From the floodplains of Mesopotamia to the highlands of Anatolia, the Assyrians expanded gradually, learning from each conquest. Early campaigns were measured and precise. Later, they became unstoppable forces that reshaped borders and subjugated neighboring peoples. Their legacy, preserved in ruins, inscriptions, and artifacts, offers insights not just into their conquests, but into the human drive for order, power, and enduring influence. To truly grasp the significance of the Assyrians is to understand that history is rarely linear. Empires rise in response to opportunity and necessity, and even those built on the foundations of fear and power leave indelible marks on culture, art, and knowledge. The Assyrians, for all their brutality, were architects of civilization in ways that extend far beyond their military achievements. Their story is both a warning and a lesson that ambition, when paired with organization and vision, can achieve extraordinary heights, but that no empire is immune to the consequences of overreach and hubris. This is the story of the Assyrians, a civilization whose reach extended across the ancient Near East, whose innovations reshaped warfare and governance, and whose cultural and intellectual achievements still resonate. It is the story of how a city-state became an empire, how ambition intertwined with intelligence, and how history remembers both the conquerors and the culture they left behind. Long before the Assyrian Empire dominated the ancient Near East, the heart of what would become one of history's most formidable civilizations lay in a modest city known as Assur. Situated on the western bank of the Tigris River, Assur was not the largest city in Mesopotamia nor the wealthiest, yet it would become the seed of an empire whose reach would eventually span from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The origins of Assyria are intertwined with the broader history of Mesopotamia, a land cradled by two great rivers. This was a place where agriculture could flourish, yet it demanded constant vigilance. Seasonal flooding nourished the soil, but also brought destruction if mismanaged. In this landscape, early communities learned to build canals, manage irrigation, and establish governance systems to regulate the flow of water, the lifeblood of survival. The earliest Assyrians were not isolated innovators. They drew inspiration from Sumerian city-states to the south and the Akkadian Empire before them. The Sumerians inherited urban planning, cuneiform writing, and religious rituals. From the Akkadians, they learned diplomacy, administrative organization, and military strategy. Yet over time, the Assyrians began to forge an identity distinct from their neighbors. While influenced by others, they would become assertive, expansionist, and uniquely disciplined. Assur itself was both a political and religious center. Its temples were dedicated to Assur, the city's patron god, whose name the Assyrians would later lend to their empire. Assur was not merely a deity. He was a symbol of authority, justice, and war. Kings, both early and later, claimed to derive their power from him, creating a divine legitimacy that intertwined governance with spirituality. The temple was central to life in Assur. It regulated not only religious rituals, but also trade, education, and judicial matters. Priests wielded influence over civic affairs, and scribes recorded the minutiae of administration, creating a foundation for the empire's later bureaucratic genius. Trade was another cornerstone of early Assyria. Despite its relatively small size, Assur became a hub connecting regions across Mesopotamia and beyond. Goods such as tin, textiles, and luxury items flowed along river routes and overland caravans. Early Assyrian merchants were known for their shrewdness and organizational skill, laying the groundwork for an economy capable of supporting armies and monumental construction in centuries to come. The political structure of early Assyria reflected both pragmatism and ambition. The king was not merely a symbolic figurehead. He was judge, commander, and religious leader. This centralization of authority allowed Assur to maintain internal cohesion and respond effectively to external threats. At the same time, the city-state system fostered a culture of competition and vigilance. Neighboring polities, such as Mari and Babylon, were both rivals and teachers, providing lessons in diplomacy, warfare, and administration that would later define Assyrian strategy on a grander scale. Archaeological evidence from Assur and surrounding settlements paints a vivid picture of these early times. Excavations have revealed residential districts, workshops, temples, and administrative archives. Cuneiform tablets from the mid-2nd millennium BC document trade agreements, religious offerings, and early legal codes. These records illustrate a society deeply concerned with order, accountability, and divine favor, a society already laying the framework for an empire that would eventually command fear and respect across the ancient Near East. The early Assyrians were also keenly aware of the importance of military preparedness. Even as a small city-state, Assur maintained a trained militia, capable of defending its trade routes and agricultural lands. Early conflicts with neighboring cities were frequent, and each skirmish provided lessons in strategy, fortification, and the psychology of warfare. By observing the successes and failures of other Mesopotamian powers, the Assyrians developed a pragmatic, disciplined approach that would later allow them to dominate far larger territories. Yet culture and society were as important as military prowess. Family structures, education, religious festivals, and communal work all contributed to social cohesion. The scribes of Assur meticulously recorded events, commercial transactions, and religious observances, creating a sense of continuity that would persist through generations. Even in times of conflict, these records allowed the city to maintain its identity, values, and knowledge, a remarkable feat for a society on the verge of empire. By the time the first historically attested kings rose to prominence in Assur, the city had already established the institutions necessary for expansion. These kings understood that legitimacy derived not only from conquest, but from the ability to maintain law, order, and religious favor. Ashur's influence permeated every decision, every treaty, and every battle plan. The fusion of civic responsibility, divine sanction, and strategic vision formed the backbone of what would become the Assyrian Empire. This era also saw the first experiments in governance that would later define imperial administration. Assur maintained officials responsible for taxation, trade oversight, and judicial enforcement. Early codifications of law regulated property, commerce, and interpersonal conduct. These measures ensured social stability and created a model that could be scaled when the Assyrians expanded their reach. Perhaps most importantly, the people of Assur cultivated an understanding of historical memory. Annals, inscriptions, and epic tales preserved the deeds of kings, victories in battle, and acts of piety. This focus on recording history served a dual purpose. It legitimized rulers and inspired future generations to continue the work of expansion, administration, and cultural preservation. The origins of Assyria, then, are not merely a story of a single city-state. They are the story of human ingenuity, adaptation, and ambition. From the floodplains of Mesopotamia to the city streets of Assur, early Assyrians learned to balance trade with diplomacy, warfare with administration, and religious devotion with political strategy. These foundational choices, made over centuries, enabled a modest city to evolve into a civilization capable of forging one of the most powerful empires the ancient world had ever seen. The city of Assur became more than a place. It became an idea that power could be disciplined, conquest could be organized, and culture could endure even amid war. In these early centuries, the seeds were planted for the rise of the Assyrian Empire, a society that would eventually redefine what it meant to rule, to govern, and to leave a legacy for the ages. By the late 14th and early 13th centuries BCE, Assur had evolved from a modest city-state into a kingdom with aspirations beyond its riverbanks. It was during this time that the first historically attested Assyrian kings emerged, leaders whose vision, ambition, and political acumen would lay the foundation for centuries of imperial rule. Among these early rulers, Ashur-uballit stands out. His reign, beginning around 1365 BCE, marked a turning point. Before him, Assyria had existed largely under the shadow of more powerful neighbors, particularly Babylon. The region's political landscape was dominated by alliances, vassalage, and tribute systems, and Assyria was often forced to pay respect to its stronger southern neighbor. Ashur-uballit changed this dynamic. Through careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and well-planned military campaigns, he declared Assyria's independence from Babylonian dominance, asserting the kingdom's sovereignty and signaling the dawn of a new era. What set Ashur-uballit and his contemporaries apart was their dual approach to governance. They understood that power rested on three intertwined pillars: military strength, administrative control, and divine legitimacy. The king was not merely a warlord. He was a judge, a legislator, and a priest. In Assyrian ideology, his authority was granted by Ashur himself, the city's patron deity. And this religious sanction reinforced the king's ability to command both loyalty and fear. Military campaigns under these early kings were calculated and precise. Unlike later conquests characterized by total annihilation, early Assyrian campaigns were strategic, designed to secure borders, protect trade routes, and demonstrate power. Assyrian armies were organized into units with specific roles, and although the technology of iron weaponry was still emerging, they demonstrated remarkable discipline, coordination, and tactical innovation. Archers, spearmen, and chariot units operated under a unified command, creating a force that could strike swiftly and effectively. These early kings also laid the groundwork for administrative systems that would define the Assyrian state. Provincial governors, scribes, and tax collectors were established to oversee trade, agriculture, and urban management. Legal codes began to regulate both civil and commercial life. By centralizing authority, these rulers ensured that Assyria could maintain internal cohesion while preparing for the expansion that would come in later centuries. Ashur-uballit, I was not alone in this endeavor. Adad-nirari, his successor, expanded Assyria's influence further. He engaged in campaigns along the Euphrates, consolidating power over surrounding city-states and forging alliances that strengthened the kingdom's regional standing. These rulers recognized that military victory alone was insufficient. Diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the incorporation of conquered elites into the Assyrian system were equally vital. The symbolism of kingship during this period cannot be overstated. Reliefs and inscriptions from the era depict kings standing between gods and men, holding symbols of authority and receiving divine guidance. Such imagery reinforced the notion that the king was both mortal and divine, capable of executing justice, waging war, and ensuring prosperity. This duality, mortal ruler, divine representative, would persist throughout Assyrian history, becoming a cornerstone of imperial ideology. Economically, the first Assyrian kings understood the importance of trade and resource management. Assur's position along the Tigris made it a hub for merchants and caravans, connecting regions that produced timber, metals, textiles, and luxury goods. Royal oversight ensured that trade routes were secure and taxation was systematically collected. Surpluses were stored in granaries and warehouses, enabling Assyria to support larger armies and undertake monumental construction projects. Culturally, these kings encouraged the growth of literature, religious scholarship, and administrative records. The earliest clay tablets from Assur reveal meticulous record-keeping of both civic and religious matters. Annals documented campaigns, treaties, and tribute collections, while religious texts codified rituals, prayers, and offerings. This attention to documentation not only legitimized the king's authority, but also created a continuity of knowledge that later rulers would exploit as they expanded their territories. The reigns of these early kings illustrate a delicate balance. They combined force with diplomacy, innovation with tradition, and fear with legitimacy. Their successes were not solely due to military conquest. They were rooted in strategic governance, religious integration, and societal cohesion. By the time the Neo-Assyrian period would arrive centuries later, these foundational principles of centralized authority, military discipline, and divine sanction would underpin the empire's extraordinary achievements. It is also worth noting the human aspect of these early rulers. Inscriptions suggest that they faced constant challenges, rebellions, border disputes, and the pressures of succession. Yet they persevered, often employing both negotiation and force to maintain stability. This adaptability, this understanding of human psychology, would become a hallmark of Assyrian kingship and contribute to the durability of their civilization. The first Assyrian kings thus set the stage for a civilization that would eventually dominate the Near East. They proved that power could be consolidated not just through force, but through governance, economic management, and the careful cultivation of religious and cultural legitimacy. These rulers were visionaries in their time, laying down the principles that would allow a single city-state to evolve into an empire capable of extraordinary feats of conquest, administration, and cultural achievement. In many ways, the story of these early kings is a story of ambition measured by wisdom. They understood that a kingdom's strength was built on multiple foundations: the sword, the law, and the favor of the gods. And it is this understanding that allowed the Assyrians, from modest beginnings in the city of Assur, to embark on a path that would one day reshape the ancient world. By the time the Assyrians had emerged as a formidable kingdom, one principle had become clear: survival and dominance in the ancient Near East depended on military prowess. The region was a mosaic of city-states, kingdoms, and nomadic groups, each vying for resources, land, and influence. To rise above rivals, the Assyrians realized that raw strength alone was insufficient. They needed innovation, organization, and strategy. What set the Assyrians apart was not merely their ferocity, but their systematic approach to war. They were among the first civilizations to develop a professional standing army, distinct from the temporary levies drawn from the peasantry during times of conflict. Soldiers were trained year-round, drilled in tactics, formations, and siege techniques. This discipline allowed them to respond rapidly to threats, projecting power far beyond the borders of Assur. Iron weaponry was a game-changer. While bronze remained common in neighboring regions, the Assyrians embraced iron for swords, spears, and arrowheads. This technological advantage gave them superior durability, sharper edges, and greater lethality in battle. Combined with carefully structured units, iron weaponry ensured that Assyrian soldiers could engage enemies with unprecedented effectiveness. The Assyrians were innovators not only in technology, but in logistics and strategy. Armies were organized into specialized divisions: archers, spearmen, charioteers, and siege engineers. Each unit had a specific role, and communication across the battlefield was meticulously coordinated. Chariots, drawn by powerful horses, were used to break enemy lines, while archers provided covering fire, and infantry advanced under precise orders. Such coordination allowed smaller forces to defeat numerically superior enemies, a hallmark of Assyrian military genius. Siege warfare, long a challenge for ancient armies, became an area where Assyrians excelled. Cities were fortified with massive walls and defensive towers, yet Assyrian engineers devised battering rams, siege towers, and mining techniques to overcome these defenses. The assault on city walls was no longer a chaotic rush, but a calculated operation, involving reconnaissance, supply management, and psychological pressure. Defenders who had once relied on the strength of stone found themselves vulnerable to a combination of technology and strategy. Psychological warfare was another key element. Assyrian kings understood that fear could be as effective as force. Inscriptions and reliefs describe campaigns in which conquered peoples were subjected to public executions, mass deportations, and displays of brutality. While these acts were horrifying, they served a clear strategic purpose, deterring rebellion and discouraging resistance. The message was unmistakable defiance of Assyria came at a cost. In this way, terror itself became a tool of empire, enabling the Assyrians to control vast territories with fewer troops. Yet their cruelty was tempered by pragmatism. Deportation policies, for example, were not merely punitive, they were administrative tools. By relocating populations, Assyrians weakened potential insurgencies and repopulate conquered regions with loyal subjects. This practice also facilitated cultural integration and the spread of Assyrian influence, ensuring that conquered peoples could contribute to the empire's economy and infrastructure. Assyrian military campaigns were meticulously planned. Kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II kept detailed annals of their operations, recording distances marched, numbers of troops, and spoils of war. These records reveal a culture of strategic thinking rarely seen in the ancient world. Military planning extended beyond immediate objectives. Logistics were paramount. Supplies, weapons, and reinforcements were calculated in advance, ensuring that armies could sustain campaigns across deserts, rivers, and mountains. The importance of fortifications and mobility cannot be overstated. Assyrian engineers built roads connecting major cities, enabling rapid troop movements and communication across the empire. Bridges, canals, and supply depots supported campaigns deep into foreign territory. Such infrastructure not only facilitated conquest, but also reinforced administrative control, linking distant provinces to the central authority of the king. Assyrian innovation extended even to intelligence and reconnaissance. Scouts gathered information about enemy positions, terrain, and troop movements, while messengers maintained communication lines. Kings valued information as much as soldiers, understanding that knowledge could turn the tide of war. This combination of discipline, technology, logistics, and intelligence made the Assyrian army one of the most formidable military machines of the ancient world. Moreover, the Assyrians were not content with mere conquest. They integrated conquered territories into a structured administrative system, often leaving local rulers in place under the supervision of Assyrian governors. Garrison towns were established to maintain order, and roads were constructed to ensure the rapid deployment of troops if rebellion arose. This integration of military dominance with governance exemplifies the Assyrian understanding of empire. Power was not just taken, it was sustained. Even today, archaeologists marvel at the remnants of Assyrian fortifications, siege ramps, and military installations. Reliefs from palaces in Nineveh and Nimrud depict battles, chariots, and siege engines in intricate detail, providing insight into their advanced military culture. These artistic records were not mere decoration. They were propaganda, designed to project strength, intimidate rivals, and glorify the king's achievements. The legacy of Assyrian military innovation is profound. They influenced later civilizations across the Near East, from the Babylonians to the Persians, who adopted elements of Assyrian organization, strategy, and engineering. The concept of a professional standing army, combined with meticulous logistics and psychological tactics, would echo through history long after the empire itself had fallen. In the end, the story of Assyrian military power is not only one of iron and blood. It is a story of ingenuity, discipline, and vision. From modest beginnings in the city of Assur, the Assyrians transformed warfare into an instrument of empire. Their armies were not simply tools of destruction. They were expressions of a civilization that understood the delicate balance between fear, order, and strategy. Through these innovations, they built an empire that commanded respect and dread, leaving an enduring legacy that continues to fascinate historians and enthusiasts alike. While the Assyrians are often remembered first for their military prowess and unrelenting campaigns, their society was far more complex than the battlefield alone suggests. Beneath the image of the fearsome conqueror lay a civilization marked by intellectual curiosity, religious devotion, artistry, and administrative sophistication. To understand the Assyrians, one must look beyond the swords and chariots to the libraries, temples, palaces, and streets where their civilization thrived. At the heart of Assyrian culture was the intertwining of religion and governance. The king ruled not merely as a political figure, but as a representative of the gods, most importantly Assur, the patron deity of Assur and the empire. Religious authority was central to social cohesion. Priests advised kings, oversaw rituals, and maintained the temples that formed the spiritual and civic heart of the cities. Festivals, offerings, and rituals punctuated the calendar, reinforcing the connection between divine favor and political stability. Every act of governance, from taxation to military mobilization, was framed as serving the will of the gods. The Assyrians were also unparalleled builders. Palaces and temples were adorned with intricate bas-reliefs depicting kings, gods, battles, and ceremonial events. These artworks were not merely decorative, they were statements of power, piety, and legitimacy. The reliefs communicated the king's authority to subjects and visitors alike, immortalizing victories and reinforcing the divine mandate behind Assyrian rule. Cities like Nineveh, Nimrud, and Kalhu became centers of architectural innovation, featuring monumental gateways, ziggurats, and elaborately decorated walls. Beyond architecture, the Assyrians nurtured scholarship and record-keeping. The famous library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh preserved thousands of cuneiform tablets, ranging from administrative records and legal documents to literature, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Works like the Epic of Gilgamesh were copied, preserved, and studied, revealing a civilization that valued knowledge as much as conquest. Scribes, trained from a young age in cuneiform writing, were highly respected professionals. They maintained annals, trade records, legal codes, and religious texts, ensuring that the decisions of kings, the movements of armies, and the administration of cities were meticulously documented. Trade was another cornerstone of Assyrian society. The empire's strategic location allowed it to serve as a hub connecting the Persian Gulf, Anatolia, and the Levant. Merchants transported timber from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia, textiles from Egypt, and luxury goods from distant lands. Assyrian markets thrived, facilitating the flow of wealth and ideas. Economic prosperity supported not only the army, but also monumental construction and the patronage of arts and scholarship. Daily life in Assyria was structured yet varied. The majority of the population engaged in agriculture, producing grains, fruits, and livestock along the fertile floodplains. Artisans crafted pottery, jewelry, textiles, and tools, supporting both domestic needs and long-distance trade. Women, while primarily responsible for household and family management, could also participate in religious ceremonies and, in some cases, administrative tasks, especially within temple precincts. Social hierarchy was rigid but functional. At the top stood the king and royal family, followed by the nobility, military officers, and priests. Below them were merchants, artisans, farmers, and laborers. This hierarchy allowed for efficient governance and resource allocation. Yet, it also reflected the Assyrian understanding of order. Every individual had a role, and societal stability was maintained through law, duty, and divine oversight. Education and intellectual development were highly valued, particularly among the elite. Young men trained as scribes learned mathematics, astronomy, and law, while also studying literature and religious texts. Knowledge was considered a tool of power. Scribes and scholars provided the king with critical information on diplomacy, taxation, and military logistics. This integration of education into governance further strengthened the state's capacity to manage its growing territories. Religion permeated every aspect of life. Kings often undertook grand building projects as acts of piety, funding the construction or renovation of temples and ziggurats. Rituals marked every stage of life, from birth to death, and festivals punctuated the calendar, celebrating seasonal cycles, military victories, and divine favor. Gods were both protectors and arbiters. Prophecies, omens, and divination guided decisions in war, diplomacy, and internal administration. Cultural achievements also extended to literature and the arts. Epic tales, hymns, and chronicles reflected a society that valued memory, heroism, and the deeds of gods and men. Music and dance accompanied religious and civic ceremonies, while artisans produced finely carved statues, jewelry, and decorative items that showcased technical skill and aesthetic sensibility. These creative endeavors were not frivolous. They reinforced social cohesion, celebrated power, and communicated the sophistication of Assyrian civilization to allies and subjects alike. Even amid war and conquest, the Assyrians maintained infrastructure and urban planning. Roads, bridges, canals, and fortified walls enabled trade, communication, and military movement. Cities were carefully organized, with distinct districts for administration, worship, markets, and residences. Public works projects driven by both practicality and propaganda reflected the empire's ability to mobilize labor, resources, and expertise on a scale that few contemporary civilizations could match. Perhaps the most striking feature of Assyrian society was its balance of fear and culture. While the empire was feared for its military campaigns and harsh enforcement of authority, it was also admired for its administration, scholarship, and art. This duality, combining terror with civilization, was not accidental. It was a conscious strategy of governance. By projecting strength while fostering economic, religious, and cultural life, the Assyrians ensured both dominance and continuity. The culture and society of the Assyrians reveal a civilization that was more than the sum of its armies. They were builders, scholars, administrators, and patrons of the arts, whose innovations in governance, literature, and religion influenced future empires across the Near East. In their libraries, temples, and palaces, we see a society deeply aware of its own power, its responsibilities, and the impermanence of all human achievement. Through this lens, we can understand that the Assyrians were not merely conquerors. They were a civilization that combined intellect, organization, and devotion to create a society capable of sustaining an empire. Their culture was the scaffold upon which their military might and political ambition rested, a civilization that thrived not only through conquest, but through the cultivation of knowledge, faith, and civic order. Even today, the remnants of Assyrian society, cuneiform tablets, monumental architecture, and religious traditions offer a window into a world where war, governance, and culture were inseparable. Their story is a reminder that an empire's strength is measured not only by the extent of its conquests, but by the resilience, complexity, and ingenuity of the society that sustains it. The Neo-Assyrian Empire represents the culmination of centuries of Assyrian development, a period when the ambitions of a city-state in Mesopotamia transformed into one of the most formidable empires the ancient world had ever seen. From the 10th century BCE onward, Assyria rose to unprecedented heights under kings whose vision, military genius, and administrative skill reshaped the Near East. The Neo-Assyrian period is defined by figures such as Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, rulers who perfected both the art of war and the science of governance. Tiglath-Pileser III, ascending the throne in the mid-8th century BCE, revolutionized the empire. He reorganized the army into a professional, mobile force capable of rapid campaigns across diverse terrains. He introduced provincial governors, trusted officials who oversaw conquered territories, collected tribute, and enforced Assyrian law. These reforms transformed Assyria from a powerful kingdom into an empire capable of controlling vast, heterogeneous populations. Sargon II, another towering figure, consolidated and expanded the empire's reach further, moving beyond Mesopotamia into Anatolia, the Levant, and parts of the Persian Gulf. His campaigns were meticulously planned, combining military innovation with political strategy. Cities were conquered, yet Sargon also understood the importance of infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and fortified garrisons allowed Assyria to maintain control over distant provinces. These innovations were not only logistical but psychological. The display of imperial order reinforced the notion of Assyrian dominance, discouraging rebellion before it could take root. The empire's capital cities, including Nineveh, Calhu, and Dur-Sharrukin, were more than administrative centers. They were symbols of imperial authority. Palaces and temples were constructed on a scale never before seen, adorned with reliefs that depicted campaigns, divine favor, and royal power. These visual narratives were part of a deliberate strategy to project legitimacy, impress allies, and intimidate adversaries. The Neo-Assyrian kings understood that an empire relied not only on armies, but on the perception of the image of invincibility and divine sanction. One of the defining characteristics of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was its administrative sophistication. Provinces were integrated into a complex system of governance. Governors, military commanders, and scribes coordinated taxation, law enforcement, and census-taking. Tribute from subjugated states flowed into the imperial treasury, supporting both military campaigns and monumental construction projects. Communication networks, including roads and relay stations, allowed the central government to issue orders and respond to uprisings swiftly. Trade flourished under the empire. The Neo-Assyrians controlled vital routes connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia, the Levant, and the Persian Gulf. Merchants transported timber, metals, textiles, and luxury goods, while artisans produced objects for both domestic consumption and tribute to the king. This economic integration ensured that the empire could support large armies and sustain ambitious architectural and infrastructural projects. Religion remained a central pillar of the empire. The king was seen as the representative of Assur on earth, acting as both spiritual guide and political authority. Conquered peoples were often required to participate in Assyrian religious rituals, reinforcing the authority of the state and the divine justification for Assyrian rule. Prophecies, omens, and divinations guided military campaigns and administrative decisions alike. The intertwining of religion and governance created a society in which obedience, ritual, and political loyalty were inseparable. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was also a crucible of cultural innovation. Scribes continued to copy and preserve literature, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, building on the intellectual foundations of earlier Assyrian periods. Libraries, most famously that of Ashurbanipal, preserved knowledge that would later inform scholars across the ancient world. Arts and craftsmanship flourished. Palace reliefs, jewelry, and textiles conveyed power, beauty, and ideological messaging simultaneously. Military conquest remained central to Assyrian identity, but by this period, it was paired with a nuanced understanding of control and integration. Deportation and resettlement policies redistributed populations to minimize rebellion while promoting economic productivity. Newly conquered territories were garrisoned and integrated into provincial systems. Roads facilitated both trade and the rapid deployment of troops. Every military campaign was designed not merely to destroy, but to incorporate turning victories into sustainable administration. Yet the Neo-Assyrian Empire was not monolithic. It faced constant challenges: rebellious provinces, rival powers like Babylonia and Elam, and internal succession disputes. Even the most capable kings had to navigate a delicate balance between force, diplomacy, and administration. The success of the empire depended on this interplay of leaders capable of both ruthlessness and foresight. By the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire reached its geographic and administrative zenith. It spanned from the Persian Gulf in the southeast to the Mediterranean coast in the west, and from Anatolia in the north to the deserts of Arabia in the south. Its influence was felt not only through military dominance, but through economic networks, religious imposition, and cultural diffusion. The empire's power was sustained by a combination of centralized authority, military innovation, administrative rigor, and the projection of divine legitimacy. The Neo-Assyrian Empire demonstrates that true imperial power lies not only in conquest, but in governance. It shows the importance of logistics, communication, and infrastructure, the integration of religion and political authority, and the cultivation of culture and knowledge alongside military campaigns. The empire's achievements would influence civilizations for centuries, from the Babylonians who followed to the Persians and beyond. Yet, even at the height of its power, the Neo-Assyrian Empire foreshadowed the fragility inherent in human ambition. Vast territories were difficult to manage, harsh rule bred resentment, and internal strife threatened stability. The stage was set for the eventual decline of one of history's greatest empires, a story of ambition and brilliance, but also of vulnerability and impermanence. The Neo-Assyrian Empire stands as a testament to what human organization, vision, and determination can achieve. It was an empire built on discipline, intelligence, and the careful integration of culture, religion, and administration into the machinery of power. And it is in this period that the Assyrian story reaches its grandest scale, a civilization that transformed a single city into a dominion that reshaped the ancient Near East, leaving a legacy that continues to resonate through history. At its zenith, the Assyrian Empire was an unparalleled force in the ancient world. By the late 7th century BCE, its dominion stretched from the Persian Gulf in the southeast to the Mediterranean coast in the west, and from the highlands of Anatolia in the north to the deserts of Arabia in the south. Few civilizations before or after could match the sheer scale, organization, and reach of the Assyrians. This was a civilization at the apex of ambition, engineering, and administration. The empire's military dominance was unquestioned. Armies were professional, disciplined, and strategically organized. Campaigns were meticulously planned, logistics calculated, routes scouted, supply lines secured. Assyrian generals employed innovative tactics that combined mobility, siege technology, and psychological warfare. Cities that had stood unchallenged for centuries fell to battering rams, siege towers, and the precision of an army trained for conquest. But it was not brute force alone that enabled such dominance. The Assyrians understood that power required control, governance, and perception. Administration reached a level of sophistication that allowed the king to project authority across vast distances. Provincial governors oversaw tribute collection, law enforcement, and the maintenance of roads and infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and fortified garrisons linked cities across the empire, enabling rapid troop deployment and secure communication. Trade flourished along these arteries, ensuring that the economy supported both armies and monumental building projects. This fusion of military power and bureaucratic efficiency made the empire resilient, yet it also revealed the delicate balance of imperial control. The Assyrian approach to conquered peoples was both pragmatic and brutal. Deportation, resettlement, and forced labor were used strategically to suppress rebellion and integrate populations into the empire. By relocating elites and skilled laborers, Assyria could stabilize regions, prevent uprisings, and exploit human resources effectively. Cities were garrisoned and infrastructure built to reinforce both political and military control. These policies created an empire that, while feared, could function with remarkable efficiency. Cultural and religious influence was another cornerstone of Assyrian power. Kings were seen as divine representatives of Assur, and religious authority reinforced political legitimacy. Temples, palaces, and monumental reliefs projected an image of invincibility, immortalizing military victories, royal achievements, and the favor of the gods. Festivals, rituals, and religious observances permeated daily life, binding the population to a shared ideological framework that legitimized Assyrian rule. The empire's cities reflected this dominance. Nineveh, Calhu, and Dur-Sharrukin were not just administrative centers. They were symbols of imperial power, adorned with towering walls, grand palaces, and intricate reliefs depicting war, divinity, and kingship. The urban landscape itself became a tool of governance, reinforcing the hierarchy and authority of the Assyrian state. Scholars, scribes, and artisans contributed to a culture of knowledge preservation, ensuring that literature, mathematics, astronomy, and administrative records were maintained across generations. Economically, the empire thrived on integration and control. Trade routes connected resource-rich regions to the imperial core. Timber from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia, and luxury goods from the Levant and Egypt flowed into Assyrian markets. Agricultural lands were carefully managed, and taxes and tributes ensured that wealth could be mobilized for military campaigns, urban development, and monumental construction. In this way, economic might reinforce military and political power. Yet, even at its greatest, the empire faced intrinsic challenges. Its vast size made it difficult to govern, and the harsh rule that ensured obedience also bred resentment among subjugated populations. Revolts, though often suppressed, were a constant threat. The efficiency of administration depended on capable rulers. Succession disputes, weak leadership, or local corruption could destabilize entire regions. The Assyrian experience demonstrates a fundamental lesson of empire. Power is not absolute, and expansion carries inherent fragility. The Assyrian Empire at its height also showcased a balance between terror and civilization. The fear inspired by brutal campaigns and deportations was paired with the promotion of knowledge, culture, and infrastructure. Palaces, temples, libraries, and roads were as essential to Assyrian dominance as the army itself. This dual strategy, governing through both fear and administrative sophistication, allowed the empire to sustain itself across generations, projecting influence far beyond the battlefield. Internationally, the Assyrians dominated not only through conquest, but through diplomatic pressure and strategic alliances. Neighboring states, from Babylon to Egypt, recognized the might of Assyria and often sought treaties or tribute arrangements to avoid devastation. The empire's influence extended across borders not only by force, but through a carefully constructed image of invincibility, maintained through both propaganda and practical governance. The height of Assyrian power is a testament to the civilization's ability to integrate military, administrative, economic, and cultural systems into a coherent and formidable empire. It illustrates that imperial success depends not solely on conquest, but on infrastructure, governance, and the perception of authority. Yet, even in this pinnacle, the seeds of decline were present. Overextension, harsh rule, and internal pressures foreshadowed the eventual unraveling of what had seemed invincible. The story of Assyria at its apex is one of extraordinary human achievement and ambition. It is a civilization that mastered war, administration, and culture simultaneously, demonstrating that power is most effective when multifaceted. And yet, it serves as a reminder that even the greatest empires carry inherent vulnerabilities. For the larger the dominion, the more precarious its control. The Assyrians achieved heights that few could match, But as history would soon show, even the mightiest can fall. Even the mightiest empires are not eternal. By the late 7th century BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, once an unrivaled power stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, and from Anatolia to Arabia, began to unravel. The forces that had driven its expansion and dominance now revealed their consequences: overextension, internal strife, and the resentment of subjugated peoples. Several factors converged to weaken Assyria from within. The empire's vast size, while a testament to organizational skill, made centralized governance increasingly difficult. Provincial governors, while loyal in theory, sometimes acted with autonomy, and corruption, mismanagement, and local rebellion became growing concerns. Succession disputes among the royal family further destabilized the state, as rival claimants vied for the throne. A pattern emerged that would repeat across history. The larger the empire, the more fragile the chain of command. Economic pressures also contributed to the decline. Maintaining armies, infrastructure, and monumental projects required enormous resources. Heavy taxation and forced labor imposed on both conquered peoples and the Assyrian heartland generated widespread resentment. While tribute and trade had once fueled the empire's power, they increasingly became sources of friction. Farmers, artisans, and urban populations faced demands that strained their livelihoods, fostering discontent that would weaken loyalty to the crown. External pressures compounded internal instability. Assyria's neighbors, long subdued or intimidated, began to recognize the empire's vulnerability. The Babylonians, under the leadership of Nabopolassar and the Medes, a powerful Iranian people from the northeast, formed alliances to challenge Assyrian dominance. This coalition understood that the empire's military might, formidable though it was, could no longer guarantee submission across its entire territory. The cracks in Assyria's control provided the opportunity for revolt and liberation. The final chapter of Assyrian power culminated in the siege and destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE. Nineveh, the great capital, had been a symbol of imperial authority for centuries, its walls towering over the Tigris, its palaces adorned with the triumphs of generations. Yet even these monumental defenses could not withstand the combined might of Babylonian and Median forces. Chroniclers describe the city's fall as catastrophic: walls breached, palaces looted, temples desecrated, and thousands of inhabitants killed or displaced. The psychological and symbolic impact was as profound as the physical destruction. Other major cities, including Kalhu, Nimrud, and Dur-Sharrukin, soon followed. What had once been an empire of discipline, terror, and administration crumbled almost overnight. Royal inscriptions that once celebrated victories were replaced by silence and ruins. The Assyrian state, which had projected an image of invincibility across the ancient Near East, vanished as a political entity within a few short years. Yet the collapse of Assyria was not total. Fragments of the population survived, dispersed across Mesopotamia and beyond. These survivors carried with them traditions, language, and cultural practices that would persist for millennia. The empire's fall illustrates a broader lesson. Even the most disciplined, innovative, and terrifying empires are vulnerable to overextension, internal decay, and coordinated external pressures. History has shown that power, if not balanced with stability and sustainability, can unravel with astonishing speed. The Assyrian story is also a cautionary tale of human ambition. The same administrative brilliance, military innovation, and cultural sophistication that enabled the empire to dominate the Near East were also factors that contributed to its vulnerability. A centralized bureaucracy, reliant on strong leadership and absolute control, faltered when faced with rebellion and rival powers. A society that depended on fear and coercion struggled when subjected to prolonged resistance and collective action from within and without. Despite the fall of the state, the Assyrian legacy endured. Knowledge preserved in libraries, monumental architecture, and artistic achievements informed neighboring civilizations, while military innovations influenced armies across the Near East. Religious traditions, administrative systems, and cultural practices continued to resonate, ensuring that the Assyrians' impact extended far beyond their political existence. The decline of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, from unparalleled dominance to catastrophic collapse, serves as a reminder that no empire, regardless of power, is immune to the forces of internal decay and external challenge. The rise and fall of Assyria illustrate that ambition without balance and conquest without sustainable governance carries inherent risk. Yet, in their achievements, their art, their innovations, and even in their methods of control, the Assyrians left an indelible mark on history, one that continues to captivate scholars, enthusiasts, and the wider world today. When the dust settled over Mesopotamia after the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE, the Assyrian Empire had vanished as a political entity. Yet the imprint of this civilization on the ancient world and on history itself was profound, enduring, and multifaceted. The Assyrians may have been defeated on the battlefield, but their innovations, culture, and influence continued to shape civilizations for centuries. One of the most visible aspects of their legacy was military innovation. The Assyrians perfected strategies, tactics, and organization that would inform the armies of subsequent empires, from the Babylonians to the Persians, and even later civilizations in Europe and Asia. Their use of iron weaponry, professional standing armies, siege engines, and logistics planning was unparalleled in the Iron Age. They demonstrated that military success was not merely about strength, but about preparation, coordination, and the integration of fear and governance into strategy. Even today, scholars studying ancient warfare often cite Assyria as a model of efficiency, innovation, and strategic foresight. The Assyrians' achievements in administration and governance were equally significant. Provincial systems, tribute collection, centralized bureaucracy, and communication networks allowed a single state to control vast and diverse territories. While overextension ultimately contributed to their decline, these administrative practices provided a blueprint for later empires. Concepts of provincial governors, taxation systems, and infrastructure to support rapid military and administrative mobility would influence the Babylonians, Persians, and eventually civilizations beyond the Near East. Culturally, the Assyrians preserved and disseminated knowledge on a scale remarkable for the ancient world. The library of Ashurbanipal, containing tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, safeguarded literature, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and diplomatic records. By copying and storing texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, Assyrian scholars ensured that knowledge endured beyond political collapse. This intellectual preservation provided subsequent generations with a window into Mesopotamian life, history, and thought, influencing scholars for centuries to come. Architecturally, the Assyrians left behind monumental palaces, temples, ziggurats, and reliefs that continue to captivate archaeologists and historians. The bas-reliefs depicting kings, gods, battles, and rituals were not only artistic achievements, but also political tools, communicating authority, divine favor, and military prowess. These works influenced artistic traditions throughout the Near East, shaping the visual language of power and propaganda in later civilizations. Trade networks established by the Assyrians created enduring economic links across the region. By connecting Mesopotamia to Anatolia, the Levant, and the Persian Gulf, the Assyrians facilitated the movement of resources, ideas, and technologies. This integration of commerce with imperial administration helped stabilize regions, supported urban centers, and allowed cultural exchange that outlasted the empire itself. The Assyrians also left a legacy in religion and ideology. Kingship as a divine mandate, The intertwining of governance and religious authority and the use of rituals to reinforce loyalty were all practices that influenced neighboring and successor states. Temples, festivals, and religious infrastructure ensured that spiritual and civic life were inseparable, a model that resonated with later Mesopotamian and Near Eastern civilizations. Beyond material and institutional legacies, the Assyrians left a human legacy. Despite the destruction of their empire, Assyrian communities survived, maintaining language, traditions, and cultural identity. Today, descendants of the ancient Assyrians preserve elements of this heritage, keeping alive a connection to one of the earliest and most powerful empires in human history. This continuity reminds us that civilizations are not solely defined by political boundaries. They endure through culture, language, and shared identity. The story of Assyria also provides profound lessons about power and empire. Their rise illustrates the potential of vision, organization, and innovation. Their apex demonstrates how military, administrative, economic, and cultural systems can be integrated to create unprecedented dominance. Yet their decline serves as a cautionary tale. Overreach, internal decay, and reliance on fear without sustainable governance can undo even the greatest achievements. Assyria teaches that resilience depends on balance, adaptability, and foresight. Even today, the echoes of Assyrian civilization resonate across history. Their military strategies are studied in war colleges. Their administrative practices are examined in governance studies. Their literature and libraries inform the understanding of early human thought and creativity. The ruins of Nineveh, Nimrud, and other cities continue to inspire archaeologists, historians, and the wider public, revealing the complexity and sophistication of a civilization that was once feared and revered. The Assyrians remind us that legacies endure not only in conquest, but in culture, knowledge, and human ingenuity. Their empire may have fallen, but their ideas, innovations, and identity transcended political collapse. In studying Assyria, we encounter a civilization that exemplified the interplay of ambition, intellect, and human endeavor, a civilization whose story continues to teach, warn, and inspire. In the final analysis, the Assyrians are more than the sum of their battles and monuments. They are a lesson in the power of innovation, the importance of governance, the endurance of culture, and the fragility inherent in human ambition. Their legacy is not confined to history books. It lives on in the principles of strategy, administration, and culture that shaped the ancient world and continue to resonate today. The story of the Assyrians is one of contrasts, brilliance and brutality, ambition and fragility, innovation and impermanence. From the humble city-state of Assur to the vast Neo-Assyrian Empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, their civilization reshaped the ancient Near East. They mastered the art of warfare, engineered sophisticated governance, preserved knowledge, and left behind monuments that continue to awe the modern world. Yet, even at the peak of power, the seeds of decline were already sown. Overextension, internal strife, economic pressures, and resentment among subjugated peoples made the empire vulnerable. When the Babylonians and Medes struck, Nineveh fell, and with it, the political entity known as Assyria ceased to exist. And yet, the empire's influence endured. Its innovations in military strategy, administration, culture, and art resonated through history, shaping the societies that followed and leaving a legacy that still captivates scholars, historians, and enthusiasts today. The Assyrians teach us that an empire is not only about conquest, but about the integration of people, ideas, economy, and culture. They demonstrate that power, while formidable, is finite, and that the structures we build, however grand, require balance, foresight, and adaptability to endure. History, as the Assyrians show, is both a mirror and a warning, a record of human ambition and its limits. And while the Assyrians disappeared as rulers, their story lives on, not only in ruins and cuneiform tablets, but in the descendants who preserve their language, traditions, and identity. Their legacy is a bridge across millennia, connecting us to a civilization that once dominated the ancient world with unmatched skill, intellect, and determination. But Assyria is only one chapter in the story of human civilization. Across time, countless empires have risen and fallen, each with lessons to teach about ambition, power, and the impermanence of dominion. The Assyrians' rise and fall is a cautionary tale, but also a source of inspiration, reminding us that vision, innovation, and organization can leave a mark that outlasts even the greatest empire. Join us next as we journey through history's forgotten kingdoms and empires, the civilizations whose triumphs and failures shaped the world we know today. From the deserts of Mesopotamia to the mountains of Anatolia, the rivers of Africa, and the plains of Europe, the echoes of the past continue to teach, warn, and inspire. History, after all, is not just a record of what was. It is a guide for what might be. The Assyrians may have fallen, but their story endures as a testament to the heights humanity can achieve, the fragility of power, and the timeless pursuit of legacy.